Well, God cheerfully gave His Son so that we could have a place with God in heaven forever. And so one of the main reasons that we need to be cheerful givers is because God is a cheerful giver. And another reason is we need to understand that God doesn't need our money. He's never needed our money. And sometimes I think, maybe because of the way some people present teaching on giving, maybe because of the way that some people's hearts are against the idea of generosity, and as sad as that is, there are people who are covetous and greedy and stingy, that when a person stands up and teaches on giving, sometimes it's presented like God needs it, and if you don't give to God, then He's not going to be able to accomplish what He wants to get done. Well, that's never been the case. The Bible has explained to us that we looked at early on in our first lesson on stewardship that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, according to Psalm 50. Haggai chapter 2 verse 8 says, God owns all the silver and gold. God has never needed your money. So why then has God asked you to give? Well, when you look in Deuteronomy chapter 8, you realize that the text there says, there at the end of that chapter, that God has made every instruction that He has made for our good always. You see, God asks us to give not because He needs the money, but because it's good for us. It helps us grow and mature. It helps us to be happier. It helps the windows of heaven to be opened for us. It helps us to be on the receiving end of that sowing and reaping, and it helps us to be on the receiving end of the joys that come with sacrificial giving and giving of ourselves. And so God's not asking for you to give to Him because He needs it. You know, the interesting thing about that is that some people in the past have worshiped what they called gods who needed their resources. And they thought that if a certain number of people didn't pray to their God, then that God would get weak and he would lose power. And Paul dealt with that over in Acts chapter 17. And he said that God is not fed or taken care of by human hands as if He needed anything. So we're looking at a situation where God is asking you to give. God doesn't need your resources because God can produce resources from anything He wants. You have the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 men, not counting women and children, and He did that with 5 loaves and 2 little fish and just multiplied it miraculously right there. I love the story where the leaders of the Jews come to Peter and they say, does your teacher pay the temple tax? And Peter said, okay, yeah, he pays the temple tax. So he goes to Jesus. And before he says anything, Jesus knows what he's going to say. And he says, Peter, let me ask you a question. He said, who has to pay taxes, the citizens of a country or the king's son? And Peter said, I guess the citizens. Jesus said, so the son is exempt from taxes? And Peter said, yes. Well, Jesus' point simply was, I'm the Son of God. I don't have to pay the temple tax. It's my Father's temple. But he then said, so that we won't offend them, go down to the sea, throw a hook in the sea, and the first fish that you catch, bring it up and look in its mouth, and you'll see a piece of gold, a stater, the text actually says. And that stater was the exact change for the temple tax for 2 people, Peter and Jesus. I don't know how much fishing you've done, but I've done quite a bit of fishing. And I've pulled fish out of creeks and ponds and lakes and rivers, and I've never seen any gold in a fish's mouth. God can provide the exact change out of the mouth of a fish. Do you think He needs your money, that somehow He can't get His work done without you? No. You need to give it. And one of the reasons we should be a cheerful giver is because God lets us be a part of His work. I don't know if you have seen this or if you remember this taking place when you were in the 1st grade or the 2nd grade. I remember it very vividly because I always wanted to be this person. The teacher would say something like, who wants to help me take these papers to the office? Do you remember the hands that would go up, and every kid in that room wanted to be the one that the teacher picked to help her take the papers to the office? It was exciting to be a part of it. You got out of your regular stuff and you got to be a part of going down to the office. You got to see the office people. You got to walk through the hall, and you were given the privilege of doing the work that the teacher could have done herself, but she was going to let one of the children be a part of it, and you got picked to do that. There's a very powerful passage that we have looked at, but just to go back over and see the import of it. You're there in 2 Corinthians, and there in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, you see that Paul is talking about that gift that's going to Judea. The Macedonians had been trying to give to Paul, and the text says that out of their deep poverty, they still wanted to give to help the Christians in Judea. But now notice what the text says in verse 4. Imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering of the saints. Do you hear what that text is saying? The Macedonians were poor, but they still wanted to give out of their deep poverty. And it looks like almost that Paul was kind of saying, you guys are kind of poor yourselves. But the Macedonians were begging them, imploring them with much urgency. Will you please let us be a part of this work? You see what's happening there? They were so excited about the opportunity to give because they had understood, they had come to the realization that it's more blessed to give than to receive. And they recognized the joy of generosity, and they just wanted to be a part of the work. You know, when you think about it, the profundity, how profound it is that God lets us be a part of His work. God could have chosen any number of ways to get the gospel to people, could have chosen any number of ways to take care of the poor, take care of those who are in need, but God has commissioned us to do that, and He lets us be a part of His work. I remember reading in a book by Billy Smith, one of those books on stewardship that I have referenced several times in this course. He was talking about how lots of times it takes money to get the gospel to places. And he referenced 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and how it is scriptural and biblical to pay people who do the preaching, and talks about don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. But he was talking about the resources that are involved in getting the gospel to people. And he said sometimes it's as simple as a tract. And he talked about a tract being 5 cents. And then he told a story about how there was a group of people, and one of them had come in contact with just a gospel tract on what they needed to do to become a Christian. And that person had seen the truth of God's plan of salvation and had followed that and found someone to baptize them into Christ as they had read in that tract from the Bible. And he said it only cost 5 cents, but it did cost 5 cents. And he said someone from a congregation of the Lord's church had to give that 5 cents to get that tract printed and get it in the hands of the people that needed it. He said afterward, he was done with the lesson and people were coming up shaking his hand, and this little boy came up. And he looked down and shook his hand and met him, and that little boy said, "Mr. Smith." And Billy said, "Yeah." He said, "You know that tract you were talking about?" And Brother Smith said, the tract in the lesson. He said, "Yeah, that tract where that person read it and it cost 5 cents, cost a nickel." And Brother Smith said, yeah, that tract that cost a nickel. He said, "That was my nickel." Well, was it his nickel? Apparently, he had put a nickel in the plate, and he had seen the connection between him putting that nickel in that plate and that tract getting to the person that needed to respond to God's plan of salvation. Took a nickel. Could God have done that any way He wanted? Could He have made sure that that resource that was needed was somehow uncovered? Any way He wanted. But He lets us be a part of His work. I was talking to the people at World Video Bible School just recently, and they were talking about a program they had started investing in, trying to make sure certain videos got in front of people who were searching for certain themes. And when they calculated it all out, it was something like 5 cents for the ad would get several hours or an hour or more of watching and viewing of that video on the specific topic that the person was looking for. 5 cents. And a person would watch a video on a specific topic on the plan of salvation or Bible study, things that they were looking for, and it would be an hour of watching for 5 cents. You know, the exciting thing about that is that God lets us be a part of his work. Another story I was hearing was about a man who does some work down in Haiti. And he has really gotten involved in the work, and they have found several young people and children that were really walking the streets that didn't have anybody to take care of them. And he has started an orphanage there, and that orphanage is responsible for feeding several hundred kids every single day. And as I was talking to him, he said, for 50 cents a day, we can literally feed kids food that they would not get any other way, and that they are really starving to death. And for 50 cents every day, for about $15 a month, we can feed a child and get them off of the streets, get them into an orphanage type school system, and we can give them food that they wouldn't get. You mean to tell me that God is going to let me be a part of feeding a child for 50 cents? For a third of what you would buy a 20-ounce bottle of Coke for? God could take care of those people in any way he wanted to, but he wants to let me be a part of that. As you look in the story of Esther, you see that the Jewish nation is going to be destroyed by Haman, and Mordecai, Esther's relative, is trying to save the Jews, and he comes to Esther and he says, you need to go speak for the Jews to the king. And she says, well, if I do that, then if he doesn't put out the golden scepter, then I could be killed. And Mordecai, in a very powerful statement, says, if you remain completely silent now, the Lord will raise up for himself someone who will deliver the Israelites, but you will be lost. See, he's telling her, you can choose to be a part of God's work, and he's letting you get to do this. And if you don't do it, God's going to let someone else do it. He's going to have someone else get involved in his work, but he wants you to be a part of it. He wants you to be a part of it because it's good for you. And it's giving you the opportunity to be a part of something bigger than yourself. And we've looked at that material from Arthur Brooks in that book, Who Really Cares? When we talked earlier about one of the first lessons that we gave about how lots of people apologize for giving and they're sorry they have to teach on it. But Brooks said, hold on just a second. That is not the approach, because when you have something that people can be a part of that is bigger than themselves, it is providing a service to them that they literally cannot get anywhere else. Can you imagine getting to be a part of God's work? And that work, as you look back, is of eternal value? Well, that's something that we could get excited about. You know, if you can't imagine it being exciting to give to God's work and to help feed people and to help people in their most dire need, and that is their spiritual condition and getting them the gospel, well, I think you got bigger issues. I was reading another source that was talking about how a man stood up and he talked about mission work and how there was such a great opportunity to get the gospel to these people, and they were going to have a collection for this very poor missionary already. And it came to this one individual, and he said, I don't want to give to that. And they said, it's such a good opportunity. You can really help us. He said, I don't believe in mission work. Well, if you don't believe in mission work and you don't believe in feeding children and you don't believe in being a part of being involved in something bigger than yourself, then okay, I can see how you might not get excited about this. But if you do, well, this is a thrilling opportunity for us. And another way that we can focus our attitudes and understand what God wants us to understand about giving is to realize that it's a great investment. And here's what I mean. You go to Matthew chapter 6, and he says there in verse 19, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. God is literally saying that there is an account for you in heaven. And you can't keep any of the money that you have, but you can send it on ahead. And a man by the name of Randy Alcorn wrote a book called The Treasure Principle, and that was his principle. That you can't keep what you have now, but you can send it on ahead. And of course, that's the scriptural teaching that you came into this world with nothing and you're going to go out of this world with nothing, but there is an account that you can build up a fund in your name that ultimately you'll get to receive that reward. You say, Kyle, tell me more about this. This sounds exciting. Oh, it is exciting. You go to Philippians chapter 4, and there in Philippians chapter 4, Paul is talking to the Philippian brethren. They're in Macedonia, and he's talking about how excited he is about the giving that they had done. And he says that you guys from the very first of my ministry were some of the people, were the only people, actually, he says in this context, that were taking care of me the whole time. He says, even when I departed from Macedonia, you continued to share with me, and you were the only congregation that did that, and it's good that you did that. But then he says in verse 17, not that I seek the gift. He said, I don't want your money. Because just prior to this, he said, I know how to be abased and I know how to abound everywhere in all things. I have learned both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. He was saying, I don't need your money. But watch what he says in verse 17. Not that I seek the gift, but I seek the fruit that abounds to your account. Do you mean to tell me that there is an account with my name on it in heaven, and that I can't keep the things that I have here on this earth, but I can send them on ahead? Yes, in fact, one of the most famous statements along these lines is a man who made the statement, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to get what he cannot lose. If I said to you that there was an investment, there was no possible way this investment could go down, no possible way you could ever lose in this investment, that the more you put in, the more ultimately you would receive, and there was an account with your name on it. And if you gave just a cup of cold water in the name of Jesus to help someone, then that would accrue to your account. Would you want to be part of an investment like that? Well, the Bible teaches in any number of places that we can send our resources on ahead. Tragically, some people don't understand that, and Brother Black used to say that if this teaching is true, and he believed absolutely it was, that there would be some people that would get up to heaven and they wouldn't have enough sent up to build them a shack. They'd be sleeping in a sleeping bag in the great wide open because they hadn't sent enough up to even put a roof over their heads. Well, he was being a little facetious, but the question would arise, what are we sending on ahead of us? Because that's what we can keep. Not what we're putting in a bank account, not what we're spending here on things we're trying to save up, like a house or cars or things like that. The only thing you can keep is what you send. And there's another reason that we should give cheerfully, and I think it's very self-explanatory. When parents are
We're going to talk for just a few minutes. We'll take any comments or questions you have about anything that you've heard. But of course, the question there at the end is, what are you sending ahead? What have you sent ahead? Is it enough for a sleeping bag? Is it enough for, a lean-to against a wall? Or is it enough for a mansion, as we commonly sing and think about? It's something to consider, something challenging to consider. And this is just another one of the videos that we have that we've heard that I've thoroughly enjoyed. The examples I think he gave, I had written down 6 or 7 different illustrations to cause us to think about this. And of course, one of the ones that struck from the very beginning me was the idea that we work so hard. We work so hard sometimes to teach our children about being good givers, right? And really with the idea that sharing, I mean, most time if you don't get anything else out of kindergarten, hopefully they at least learn the idea of sharing, right? And that carries with them as they get older. But sometimes as adults, I mean, we just really lose that. We really kind of miss out, and we kind of become the opposite of being a good giver or being someone that shares the way that we've been blessed, and we sort of turn that in such a way that as adults, I mean, we're the exact opposite of that. And so it's something challenging to think about with this idea of being a cheerful giver. And he gave a bunch of different reasons there. We can work through those again. I can mention some of those to refresh your memory. But he begins with a question: do you want to be someone that God loves? And he's asked a lot of those questions that are kind of rhetorical and saying, of course, absolutely. It's like saying, do you want to go to heaven? Yeah, absolutely. But we've said time and time again, of course, in all kinds of lessons, normal, regular lessons, and even in this series, well, then at some point you've got to act like it. You got to take some kind of action. You should say it, you can say it, but you've got to take action as well. When it comes to giving, we've got to be someone who is a cheerful giver. Before I just kind of rehash a few things, any comments or questions that anything you recall we just watched, anything you want to make? Yeah.
Well, you're missing the whole point entirely there. The idea is being so happy to be involved in doing what God wants you to do, pleasing Him, that you want to give as very much as you can.
Yeah, I appreciated the example of the teacher's assistant, and that's because I married one of those kids who was really excited to get to help, right? She was in here, I'd say that in front of her face too, but she was the one that always wanted to help, and most of us were at some point. I mean, you wanted to be the one that got picked to get to be the one to go with the teacher because you felt important. You were contributing in some way, but as he makes the point in it, the teacher didn't necessarily need it. I mean, sometimes maybe they're busy and they send somebody to run an errand or whatever, but most of the time they don't need it, but they're allowing somebody to feel connected. And how wonderful it is to think about the fact that God doesn't need our money. And I've mentioned this a lot when it comes to our idea of our salvation, that God could have saved us by any way He wanted to. I mean, certainly He could have made us robots. He could have pre-selected those who are saved and those who are not. He could have told us to do any number of things. But as we've talked about, there is a plan. There is a beautiful picture in the gospel being enacted with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, and us reenacting that. The same thing is true with this, that He allows us to be a part of the work that He is doing. And we sometimes forget that. We don't think about it. And he mentioned, of course, World Video Bible School. He mentioned tracts that those people take sometimes out on the mission field. Glad Mark is here tonight. He brought Michelle with him tonight, but glad Mark is here because I think that Good News Today may be one of those things that would be sort of, main for us here at Dunlap as being overseeing congregation and really connected, but it's real easy to say, well, we've got the signs out there in the lobby. Mark shows up every once in a while. We simply talk about it, but, that's all that it is. When in truth, everything that we give, and as a congregation, the money that the elders take and set aside to oversee that work, the work that is done, sometimes goes far beyond what we can even imagine. And Mark comes to tell us that, and he often shares those good stories. He does his best to convey that, but we don't usually think about that when we're giving. In fact, I'd like to give you a challenge, something to kind of think about. During COVID and the time that we stopped passing the plate, a lot of congregations did for a while, and there was a big concern, and I talked with several other preachers and friends about the idea of, how long should we spend on the Lord's Supper? What should we be thinking? What should we be doing? The little packets, which are certainly not wrong in and of themselves, but sometimes might cause us to rush through it a little more. And heard one wise brother that said, obviously, to use those cups is not sinful. To not pass the trays is not sinful in and of itself, but one thing that passing trays does is it gives us a little bit of time. It allows us to think a little bit more. And we've got some of our men here, and again, some don't necessarily, but who spend a few moments giving us some thoughts. We're trying to think about the Lord's Supper. We're trying to focus on what we're doing and not just rush through it. But how many times do you rush through your giving? Now, we talked about this a while back, I think in a couple of sermons that I may have done, but I asked the question, is the Lord's Supper better before the sermon or after the sermon? Right? And that's a trick question. Right? It's a trick question because in some ways, some reasons it's fine to do it after, and it's a good thing to do it after. In some things, it may be okay to do it before. But I'll say this, for many of us, outside of that closing song and that closing prayer, giving is about the last thing standing between us and lunch every Sunday morning, right? And do you ever think about your giving when you are giving? Now, as I'll usually try to tell you, I'll be the first one to admit, sometimes it's not something I'm thinking about very much either. Something that, I've finished my sermon and we try to take the Lord's Supper and we're fixing to all head out of here and we're not thinking about it. But could it be that we need to think more about our giving when we give, just like we should think about the Lord's Supper when we partake of the Lord's Supper? And we are probably all guilty at some point of rushing through both of those sections of our worship service together. But, the giving, whether it's like Freddie's talking about there, that illustration, that guy's like, you got to pry it from my hands, I'm just got to peel my fingers back to give that $1, or whether it's kind of, I'm just rushing through it. Think about that in this idea of being a cheerful giver, someone who's thought about it ahead of time, as we've talked about, giving, thinking about that before Saturday night even maybe, or certainly before Sunday morning, or certainly before the invitation song kind of thing, or you should do that, but also just think about it while you're going through with that. Think about the work that can be done. Think about those Macedonians who were begging to help, even though they were in deep poverty. And it's a pretty good challenge, I think, for us to maybe continue to reframe our thinking around all these things that we've talked about and what the Bible says about proper, biblical, scriptural, liberal giving, as Kyle's quoted that multiple times in these videos. What else? Any other comments or questions here? Sure.
Made a determination as what you're going to do.
Yeah.
So that's an opportunity to think about how what you're doing is contributing to the work of the congregation and how and being thankful for it. I don't know if people are frowning putting a check in the collection plate or not.
Yeah, Freddie makes a good point. Some of that thinking about it should come before. I mean, that's what we said, and Kyle's made the point from Scripture. That's when some of that should go through. But hopefully you're thinking about it all along, and it causes you just to be joyful in that, to think about the good that can be done. I was just thinking as Freddie was saying that, one of the things that we have mentioned here is the idea that we're talking a bit about the contribution. We're talking a little bit about the plates that sit here and that we pass around. But we're also talking about the attitude and the spirit of giving, the ways that we can give to others outside of these walls, both those who are in need, those who maybe need the cold cup of water, or those who are in need of some kind of food or whatever, and certainly to each other, just simply being hospitable, giving people. All that is connected. This congregation has always been great. I mean, from our first time working here, when we first moved back around 2006, and then the time I was away preaching and now back, this congregation has always been good at giving even outside of the contribution to the things that we do here, whether it was the youth or a youth trip or the youth day or whatever it might be. If we said, hey, we're taking up a collection special just for the prom alternative, I mean, folks would give to that. So, I mean, that's, to Freddie's point, you shouldn't think about it only in that moment, but just that attitude of giving through everything that we've done and everything that we do is a part of that as well.
The men confronted or questioned the guy who was only given $1. Mm-hmm. What's obvious from what the Bible says about being your brother's keeper, you see your brother overtaken in trespass, you rebuke him, and all that in Galatians 6:1 and 2. And there in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, in the list here we got this example of this guy who's living with his father's wife. He's obviously committing adultery, committing fornication for sure. And but in the list that Paul continues to say there, he lists in the category of people who would need to be withdrawn from if they didn't repent. He also included covetous. Somebody says, well, how you don't know somebody's covetous? What if there's going to be fruit of covetousness before you can do that?
Yep.
So is that something you see, or when it comes to you don't want your right hand knowing what your left hand is doing, does that mean that we don't need to have any concern whatsoever with what somebody else is giving? That's a personal thing. But if that is the case, then how do you deal with covetousness? There's God, but how do you become aware of somebody's being covetous? It could very well be a person's a millionaire and they're giving $1. They're going to lose their soul if they quit being that covetous.
Yeah, I think we said this pretty early on, but it's a challenge. I think the way I said it was, I don't know everybody's situation here. I look around the room and I don't know what your yearly salary is, what you make, how much your family brings in, how many debts you've got. But to some extent, excuse me, to Freddie's point, we do have an idea. I mean, we know the part of the world we live in. We know in general what things are and salaries are and that kind of thing. You may have to make a judgment at some point to try to help someone with something if that comes about. And I think Freddie's heart as well as anybody, but nobody's suggesting that the guys that pass the plate are standing over everybody's shoulder and counting, exactly what goes in, or the elders are keeping a tally mark down in the elder's office of who's giving what. But that, as he mentioned there, we're pretty familiar with 1 Corinthians 5 being that passage on that sexual immorality. And we're pretty familiar with 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verses 9 and 10 about those who will not inherit the kingdom of God, the unrighteous. And I've said this a lot, but I feel like a lot of times we look at that and that list begins that fornicators or idolaters or adulterers or homosexuals or sodomites, and we might stop there. Or we might go on to verse 10 and say thieves. I'm not a thief. I'm not an adulterer or homosexual, but mentioned right there next is covetous. Those who might struggle with these things. And back to Freddie's point, it may not even have to be with how much you put in the plate, but as we have said in past weeks, it might be just the lifestyle you're living, that you might be able to make a judgment and it can tell, or especially if somebody brings it up in asking for help, maybe they have a covetousness problem by how much debt they're continuing to get into, knowing that they very well can't cover that. And they're trying to, back to the point that Kyle made, store up treasures here on earth by having the boat and the golf clubs and the golf cart and the new truck. And I mean, I sometimes pick on certain things. I usually mention a boat or golf clubs, and I pick on certain things, but it can be any number of things that we begin to accrue to make it seem like we're putting more stock here and storing up treasure here than we are there. What an investment opportunity that lies before us, as he said there at the very, very end. The opportunity to have an investment that will not fail, cannot fail, because God has made us the promise that it is not just a great investment, it is the best investment. You can't keep your money, but you can send it ahead. A lot of times we like that idea. I mean, that idea of a bank account. What if we all had a little bank account in heaven? One of the most powerful marriage examples that I love to use in my premarital counseling with folks is that idea of a love bank. I never can remember if that's his needs, her needs, I think is what it is, not the 5 love languages, but his needs, her needs, that talks about that idea of a love bank, that in a relationship you're always making deposits and withdrawing. And it's not so much that maybe you don't love someone or love your spouse when an affair occurs, but it's that sometimes that love bank gets so far in the hole, as our bank accounts sometimes do, that's when affairs are right to happen. And it's a very powerful illustration of how those things occur when somebody does that you think they would never do that. They never have an affair, they never cheat on their spouse. So we like that idea, and it helps us to think about just a plus minus, a positive or a negative. Well, what about this idea of that being that way in heaven? As we talked about a few weeks ago, grace. As we talked about grace and works, I'm not suggesting that you can do enough works to get yourself into heaven, that you can check enough boxes or of that nature, but you understand the concept of being able to send things ahead. And so that when we're thinking about our service to God, sometimes those people. I mean, they've been members here, people maybe you know from other congregations, but you just know those people. And they have that giving spirit, that giving attitude, and you just know that they've got that built up because of the way that they live their life. As Freddie talked about, fruit. We can be fruit inspectors. We can be fruit judgers. And you can tell that from somebody's bank account and their spending habits. You can tell it from their attitude and their spirit as well.
If everybody realized what Paul told Timothy, having food and raiment, and the star would be content. The closer we get to, and of course, most of the time that comes with age. It may come with age because that's when you learn to get by. but if you've got enough, and like Solomon said, don't let me have so little that I'm starving to death, and don't let me have so much that I'm misusing it. Being satisfied with what you need and not constantly focusing on what you want, goes a long way to making this possible.
Yeah. Any other comments or questions here? We still have a few minutes. Miss Lane?
I've been thinking about how Judas really lost his struggle with the love of money. Jesus' feet, and they said he did that because he had kept the money.
Mm-hmm.
And then the worst thing was he betrayed Jesus for money.
Mm-hmm. And then threw it all back when he realized exactly what it was worth, when he realized what he had done and before he went and took his own life. Absolutely. Any other comments or questions here? I was going to mention from Philippians chapter 4, as Freddie talked about, that idea of being content with what you have. We commonly mention that people pull Philippians 4:13 out, and they pull it out when things are going good. And when I'm the star football player, I can write it on my eye black, or when things are really good, then I can say that I can do all things. But as Kyle talked about, and you might need a commentary or a study guide to really go back and study that, but go back and study that whole context again. Think about the book of Philippians, especially chapter 4, the verses before 13, as he mentioned, all the way to verse 17. But it's not so much that things are great, but Paul says, I've learned to do without. I've learned to do without those things, and he appreciated their gift, but but there were other thoughts that went around that. Mark?
I think one of the things that we tend to hang our hat on is looking at the Old Testament tithe system and say, 10%, and I'm fine. What people don't realize is looking at what was even in the Old Testament, that 10% was the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There were other offerings that they were to give in addition to that, and seeing as we're under a better covenant, if we're saying, 10% is the ultimate, there's no scriptural basis for that whatsoever.
Yeah. And he brought up, I know you've not been with us through most of this, but he brought up, we kind of wrestled with the idea, he brings up in earlier chapters that you should probably set a percentage more than 10, but what that does is it keeps us honest in our giving, that when we get over, whether it's a bonus or whatever of some sort, then it's just a calculation. And I always said, to me that seems so cold, a calculation, but it does keep us honest about, I've committed to giving a percentage, but obviously, and he's brought that out too in this material, but that was the floor. And when you count the corners of the fields and you count all the other free will offerings and things of that nature, that certainly is the floor. But as Mark brings that up again, let me just challenge you, because actually I had somebody ask me about this just recently in the community. And, we were talking about, I mentioned I was teaching this, and of course, the reason I say to keep it in mind is that's the first thing that comes up, right? That's the first thing they'll say. Well, do you tithe? Do y'all tithe? Is that what you require? And it may be a chance to understand the principle and even understand where they're coming from, and then I'll also maybe be able to talk a little bit more about it. Real quick, if you have your books there, still look at page 50. I just want to mention one thing. Let me say this as well. Next week, next Wednesday night, I will be gone. My family will be at the Freed Hardeman Lectures. But as of right now, the plan is that Freddie's going, but then he's going to travel back maybe on Wednesday and be here to teach next Wednesday night. Next Wednesday night will be week 11. And so we'll plan to go on with that, sowing and reaping. But on page 50, let me make mention, there's a little bit of a review here. In that last paragraph, he says, in the previous chapters, we have discussed the importance of the command. So first of all, the command to give, doing what's right. We've covered the need to give in proportion to what we have received. So not just doing what's right, but giving the right way. And this chapter has taught us the importance of having the right attitude, giving for the right reason. And so I had underlined before, command, proportion, and right attitude. All of that goes into this. We want to try to connect all of those things and not leave something out as we're trying to think about true scriptural, biblical, liberal givers. That's what we want to be. So appreciate your good attention tonight then, and Lord be willing, Freddie will pick up there next week.